So, today we're going to be speaking a little bit more about marriage and specifically the pitfalls that people get into where they find themselves fighting or they find themselves putting their spouse down. We wanted to delve into it a little bit to understand why that happens and how to get out of it.
Yeah, and we talked last time about, John Gottman and what he says about like the 7 pillars to like a happy marriage, what he sees from his research. He also points out 4 things that he sees as a predictor to people that end up getting divorced. Four
Yeah.
common things.
Yeah, and those characteristics, the first one is criticism, which, when I heard criticism, I thought everybody criticizes, right? That's just like a human thing, to point something out. And, when I researched it a little bit more, I realized it's not just criticism, right? It's pointing something out in a very, very mean, critical way. It's not just saying hey, don't do that, or I
Right.
don't like that. It's more of you are bad for doing this. It criticizes the entire person for that action that they do.
Right. And it's also probably like a level of how much criticism, right?
Mhm.
We all and I think that this doesn't mean if you're doing this, you're getting divorced.
Right.
This is the reason why he's sharing this research is if you can realize what you're doing and you can try to find different ways of communication, that can help you have a happy, successful marriage. And one of
Yeah.
them is not falling into the pitfall of always criticizing your spouse.
Right. And I think you asked me a question earlier, which I thought was really interesting as to why do people criticize? Why do we go there?
Right. What comes up for us that leads us to being critical of other people,
Right.
that leads us to criticize people.
Right. Because if you think about it, right, your spouse is the person who's most important in your life, right? You're sharing your lives together and, you fell in love with them at one point. And then all of a sudden now, you're going to that critical space. And the answer is why?
Right.
Where's all this coming from?
Well, why do we criticize ourselves? Right? Because we all have that inner critic.
Mm-hmm.
And we're criticizing ourselves all the time. And when we're in a relationship, right, there's all different kinds of relationships. Most of the time, the marriage relationship is the one where the most feelings come up for you. So therefore, the most conflict comes up for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think before we even go to why do we criticize our husband, it's why do we criticize ourselves? Where does criticism come up from?
Right. Well, I think if we've learned, if others criticized us, we learn to criticize ourselves. But I think criticism is a motivator, right? We say oh, if I criticize myself, then I'm not going to do it again, right? If I'm so mean, then I'm not going to do it again.
Right.
And I think that comes up with spouses also. If I tell you how bad it is, then maybe you won't do it again because you'll realize the more serious I show you it is,
Right.
the more you're less likely to do it, which really doesn't work. But there's that hope of oh, if I tell you how bad it was, that you didn't, lack of better example, pick your socks up on the floor, the next time you're not going to do it because you're going to realize it's so bad that my reaction is so strong that it make you feel so awful
Right.
that maybe you won't want to feel that way again. So you won't do it.
And even though we try it doesn't work. We
No.
try it again, though. Keep
Yeah.
going back to it. I think there's a lot of insecurity that comes up that leads us to criticize, right? So if we're feeling insecure personally about something, then our inner critic would come up and be you see, you're not good. Don't try it.
Mhm.
Don't let that happen. Don't do that. Don't even go there, Or look how bad you did. You can't even do that. And I wonder if that kind of relates to a relationship also.
Mhm.
If you're insecure about something that your spouse is doing, how is this going to reflect on me? What does this mean for me? And if we
Right.
talk about something simple of you wanting a clean house and your husband is not so clean and organized, and then you're criticizing him. It's are you criticizing him because you actually are upset about the not clean house?
Mhm.
Could be. That's a possibility. Or if we take it a little deeper, are you criticizing him because it's bringing up a lot of things for you of oh, I can't handle a mess. And now it's an object that you can criticize instead of turning it inward.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's always easier to project it out rather than looking at yourself. Just because I'm going to be critical of myself, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be critical of the other person.
Right.
Right. So it doesn't always come hand in hand, but I think that's a very good point of what is it that's coming up underneath? Is it really about the socks on the floor? And sometimes it could be, right? It could be that you really do like that neat, clean house.
Right.
Other times, it can just be there's so many other things happening in your day that you're stressed, or there's so many other things happening in the relationship that seems like the easiest thing to pin it on, right? Maybe you feel unloved. Maybe you feel you're not focused on enough. Maybe you feel you're not spending enough quality time together. Maybe you feel just overwhelmed and stressed by just life responsibilities, and it's coming out in I need an organized house.
Right. It gives you a sense of control on something. If I'm critical on this, if you would just take out the garbage, my life would be fine.
Right. Yeah. And most of the time, like your life will not be fine if they just take out the garbage, right? It's not just about that thing. Like also like it could be about that trait, right? So, I want to like zoom out a bit and to say like, if someone isn't, let's say, neat, like why would that bother someone? Because technically like you can get a quick fix in it. Like, you can say, I'll be the neat one, or you can find, cleaning help, or you can find solutions to it of how to keep the house neat. But why does it bother you, right? So it could be about like, do you feel your spouse is responsible?
Right.
Do you feel your spouse cares? Like there's all these bigger things of like what it boils down to. It's like, what does this say about the person that then you're getting upset about?
Mm-hmm.
And then you might realize like, do I really need that though?
Right.
Like you might think you need that neat house, or you might think you need someone who's responsible, or you might think that this is a representation of not caring, but maybe not. Maybe you can be fine without the responsibility. Maybe you can be fine if they're not caring about that aspect of things.
Yeah.
So
the next one is contempt. Like even I know what contempt is like in my head, and I know what it looks, but I have a hard time saying that in a sentence. Like how do you define contempt?
I think it's just like making like it's sort of like a degrading of the person.
Right. Looking down.
Like sort of like making them into like a nothing.
Right. Like rolling your eyes at them when they're talking.
Yeah.
Or saying like, oh, he doesn't know anything about that. Like just ignore him.
Right.
It's like,
it's sort of like you do with your hand, like that brushing away.
That's what I'm saying. It's hard to say a sentence, but I think degrading, a looking down at them, a level of disgust.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like you're worth zero.
Right.
It's
value,
like
a low value.
Exactly, like nothingness, which can feel extremely terrible. Like to be on the receiving end of that, like talk about self-esteem, like that's basically leading somebody towards zero self-esteem. Contempt can be verbal or nonverbal. Right. It can be like you said, like rolling your eyes, or it can just be like who cares what he says, or not taking their like opinion into consideration, like not caring what bothers them.
Right. So where does contempt come from? Like if somebody's having contempt towards their spouse.
Mm-hmm. I think I see contempt as like a giving up.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's sort of like criticism, like you still feel like there's hope of like I'm gonna shake you up, I'm gonna like beat you up so that way you're gonna like do what I want. Contempt is like you're so hopeless that I'm not even trying anymore. Like I'm not even engaging. Like, and you see this sometimes like in marriages, where the couple just like doesn't believe that their marriage could even get better, that they're not even working on it anymore. It's just like, okay, he's dumb, she's dumb. Like he's not capable, she's not capable. And like it is what it is. And there's just like so much like inner disgust and hatred towards one another for that.
Yeah. And I think the contempt comes from, let's say, years or a lot of time of like disrespecting the other person.
Yeah.
I think that's where it starts from. Already not valuing them, already not looking at what they're good at and only focusing on the negative. Mm-hmm. And suddenly you're at this place where you can't stand them and they disgust you. But it didn't happen. Look, you married them for a reason, right? So it didn't happen from one day to the next, but it took years or examples of times where you turned away from them. Or you didn't value their opinion, or you didn't look at where they're good at and you only looked at where they're negative. And suddenly you're in this place of contempt. Kind of like where I said last time, where everyone's like, wait, how did we get here? So I think that like someone who's in a place of contempt, like how did they get there, is years of devaluing the other person, years of not taking them seriously.
And then just like feeling like this is hopeless. This is hopeless. There's nothing we can do about it. Like I can't stand them. And so just like pulling back and like not caring. Like, what comes to my mind is like avoidant attachment in a sense. Like I'm just like avoiding. Like, there's nothing here and just like run away from it.
I wonder if there's a correlation of people who have an attachment style of avoidant are more likely, if they're in an unhappy relationship, to be showing signs of contempt.
Interesting.
Good research study for somebody if they want to do that.
And then maybe anxious is more correlated with criticism.
I think with contempt, I think it's so much more about the person that's giving contempt than the person who's receiving it. I mean, they're probably all like that, right? Mm-hmm. They're all, the four characteristics that we're talking about that lead to divorces. I think they're all more about the person
who's doing it,
who's displaying it, than about the relationship, actually.
I think it's like the work of the person who's feeling those feelings and doing those things, like, to work on themselves. But, I'm thinking like, let's say like there is what to criticize, or let's say there is what to contempt, right? There are some times where people get married and they look at their spouse and say like, you aren't what I thought you were, or you're not as respect worthy as I thought you were, or you're doing things that are worthy of criticism in a sense. And so like, and then what? Right. So whose job is it then? So on the one hand, like it's not like it's like made up. It's not just like, oh, I'm feeling something.
But there are ways to communicate, right? And I find it very interesting how you will see people who are respectful at work, right? Respectful to people that they get in conflict with. But suddenly with their spouse, they're super critical. Right. Whereas that same like communication skills that they have in the outside world, that makes it so hard. to do it in a relationship. And there is something about it that makes it just so hard.
Well, I think like it's very different when we're in a public setting versus a private setting, right? At home is where everything comes out, right? That's where you're yourself, right? Everybody just wants to like, take off like all their professionalism and just like be them and just, like, be more authentic at home. And so like more sides are going to come out, which on the one hand makes it harder to then be respectful, because we all need spaces where we can be our true selves, right? But then it risks becoming nasty.
If somebody was messy who shared a desk with you at work or in camp and a bunk, you wouldn't be as disgusting as you'd be sometimes the people who are with their spouse.
I don't know. Camp is pretty nasty. But yeah, no, but it's true, right? Like there still is always like a barrier of like why you have to hold yourself together and pull yourself together a lot more there than you would at home. But I think like what we're really asking the question is, how do you deal with somebody, especially like, the expectations towards men, right? The expectation of they're going to fill every emotional need and they're going to understand me as deeply as I am, or they're going to help out as much as I need them to help out, and they're going to make a ton of money, and they're going to be helpful with the kids, and they're going to be helpful at home, and they're going to be clean and neat, and they're also going to learn, right? To either be learning or working, right? Whatever that arrangement is. But it's almost like the man has to do everything. And I think like that in itself is like, who are we kidding?
Right.
There's no men that exist like that.
Right.
Zero. And so like, it's almost like we're going to automatically feel contempt or criticism because we expect them to be something that's not reality. A spouse, like, a spouse basically is companionship. And well, I don't want to like break it down so simply because I think like it's it's unique for every single marriage, but like your spouse is really not your everything,
right?
And I think many women have a hard time with that, because sometimes I'll work with women that feel like their spouse is supposed to be their best friend. And then when their spouse is with their friends, their own friends, they feel left out, or that pulls them back from not going with their own friends and building out their own social scene.
Right.
And that's not the way it's supposed to be. And so it's almost like we need to break down like what it is that's bringing us towards this contempt and towards this criticism, and maybe take a real look as like, what is it that you're looking for from your spouse? Right. Because it probably doesn't exist. And the more you're going to try to get it, the more disappointed you're going to be and the more critical you're going to be, until you can come to terms and to say, whatever they can't give me, I need to go somewhere else for.
Right.
Which is fine, right? Giving permission to people to go elsewhere in healthy ways, obviously, and not to do it out of resentment of saying like, fine, because you can't go out with me, I'm going to have to go out with my friend, or because you don't understand me,
right,
I'm going to call my friend. But instead saying like, oh, my friend just gets this better, I'm going to go there because that's what makes me feel better. I think that in itself, like taking ownership of your own needs rather than expecting your spouse to like read your mind and fill them right away, can really help you avoid them criticism, because you don't have to criticize them for not filling your need.
Right.
Right. They can't fix themselves. If they don't know how to be, let's say they're not neat, they're not going to all of a sudden become neat overnight. And so instead, what do you have to do? You have to work around it. We don't like that, right? We don't want to work around things.
Right.
We don't want to take responsibility for our own things in that way. Like we want them to just fix it, and they won't. So work around it.
Yeah. So there's two more characteristics that Gottman see as like a predictor for divorce, and that's stonewalling and defensiveness. So stonewalling, right? Mm-hmm. That's like major avoidant. That's just like your spouse is talking to you and you're just watching TV. Like you're not even responding. You're not engaging.
Or just like walk away. Like in mid-conversation, it's like, thought I'm speaking to somebody, like, where'd you go?
Right.
But you see stonewalling as like a real trait that like people do, and it's kind of disrespectful.
Right. And
like,
people come to counseling like, I feel like this is something that people like say in marriage counseling, like I can't even talk to them. They just walk away mid-conversation. There's no one even there.
Right, exactly. Like they're just shutting down, or they're just like literally physically moving.
Right. And I think that for people who are stonewalling, like there's something coming up for them that limits them to not even be able to engage in conversation. I don't think they think like, I'm stonewalling right now.
No.
Versus like kind of contempt and criticism. I think it's easier to identify. Right. They may not think in their head, I'm being critical right now, but afterwards they could say, oh, wow, I was really critical. Right. Or, oh, wow, I really treated him with disrespect. Like I think those are way easier. Stonewalling, I feel like it's such an attachment style that comes up so fast that a person is not even able to identify what they're doing.
Right. I really see it as a numbness.
Right.
Of like complete, like not feeling, not there, like not being responsive like, to the other person.
I see it as like, hello, are you listening to me? Right. And it's like, oh wait, yeah. What'd you say?
Exactly. Right. Like, just finishing this email, and it's like they're not there. And you know what it might be? Like numbness like sometimes comes from escalation of feelings. Like because it feels like the feelings are too much, you have to shut down.
Yeah.
And it might be too much, right, to face certain things. So instead, it's just like out to lunch. Let's go away.
Right. But there's no way to work on a relationship like that way
Right.
if you have somebody who's out for lunch.
Right. Because the fighting is really what works through it, right? You hope that the fighting is going to lead you towards something like stonewalling.
To resolution. To
Right.
be able to get, back to kind of the 7 pillars of the foundation. One of the things that lead to happy is getting past the gridlock.
Yeah.
And stonewalling is like the gridlock.
Right.
And you can't, if you're not able to face any of the feelings or
Right.
the relationships, you're not able to move past the conflict. And if you can't move past the conflict, you're stuck in
Right.
a conflict.
And I want to like clarify, like, what we're not saying is like a certain like acceptance of the situation, right? Because sometimes like, you have to understand that this is a non-solvable problem and you're just going to sit and work with it. Stonewalling is complete ignoring
Right.
of everything. And not like mindfully choosing to ignore it.
Right.
Like it's almost like ignoring
Well,
the
it's not-
spouse,
it's not-
ignoring the problem.
Right. It's not mindfully ignoring the problem. It's mindfully ignoring the other person who's talking to you.
Right.
So,
But it's ignoring the relationship also.
Yeah.
It's just saying like the
You're
relationship
just
is
out.
not
You're not there.
Yeah.
You're out for lunch.
right, not there, not. And on the one hand, like it's not just like this like spacey person. I think it's also like we can see this in every day where
I think it's so.
you're like you said before, watching TV or just like, oh, like I'm busy at work and staying at work too long,
Right.
or like
there's ways
avoiding
to do it. Yeah.
avoiding connection, like or just like stonewalling. When someone says like, oh, do you want to do this? It's like, oh, I'll call you back.
Right.
Right. It's also like there
There's more
could be
like
talking,
smaller
but
ways to do it.
it's sort of like pushing the person away.
Right. I think it's amazing though, and I've seen this in my life. People that you're engaging with them, you're talking to them, and suddenly either you bring up something that makes them feel defensiveness, whether it's like at work having to tell like one of your employees something that they need to work on, and seeing those like shudders on their
Yeah.
eyes, and that's stonewalling happening, and I've seen it happen to me myself, and I'm always fascinated at someone who's personable and engaged, how it can really happen, how you can see that, and suddenly they walk out of the room while you're talking to them and you're like, wait, what? I'm like actually in the middle of a conversation with you.
Right.
Or suddenly they just like start so yeah, there's like that kind of like not smaller ways, but ways that you can't maybe identify that it's actually stonewalling because they're busy at work or they're watching the game or something, but then there's actual like glaring stonewalling that happens in real life too.
Yeah, for sure. It's like you literally like see them just like it's like the deer in the headlights
Yeah,
where they're just like
exactly.
frozen there, and that there's like no emotional capacity to go in. Right. There's no, and sometimes like with stonewalling is that a spouse will come up and say like, let's talk about this, or what do you think about this, or what should we do about this, and the other spouse will respond like, you always bring this up. Like, well, we have to go here again.
You're stopping a conversation from happening. That can be a form of stonewalling too.
Yeah, just like we're not going there, and it's like, but you have to go there,
Right.
But they're not going there, so that's another form of it as well. It's not just like freezing up and not
Right.
talking. It's like not having any availability for emotional connection or emotional discussions.
Yeah.
And then there's defensiveness.
Yeah. I think we can all relate to defensiveness, right?
Yeah.
It comes up, but it doesn't, again, it keeps you stuck in a gridlock if you can't kind of acknowledge the defensiveness and move it aside to have the conversation.
Right. With defensiveness, like I find that like over time that fades, where like in the moment you might feel defensive, but then like, if you take a break and like 10 minutes later, like come to your senses, you can say like, okay, fine. Like that really like hurt me, but I can move on from it.
Well, that's a way how you can get past it. Right. But I think that for some people, they stay stuck in the defensiveness and then they don't get that objectivity of to like see, oh, wait, there's actually something going on here. I understand that defensiveness, like you're talking as like a sense of like someone who's like worked through, right? Like defensiveness comes up in the moment. That's all I see. 10 minutes later, I can acknowledge where I was what brought up the defensiveness. And now I can actually work on the issue. Right. But I think we see that some people can't move past that defensiveness and therefore that keeps them stuck in the gridlock and they can't work on the issue.
Right. They're stuck in the I'm right.
Right.
Like I'm right, you're wrong.
Or
like,
whatever's coming up from them that's like the barrier to not face the emotion, similar to stonewalling. It's it's interesting. I feel like contempt and criticism is like putting on the other person, and stonewalling and defensiveness is kind of going inside.
Like retreating inside.
Interesting, no?
Yeah. And those are different personality styles. I wonder if he gendered them.
Yeah.
I think he might have. I'd have to like look back at that. But then again, everybody can do everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But all of these 4 things really like are predictors of what's going to lead to dysfunction in a relationship and in a marriage.
Yeah.
And so like through working through these 4 things, a person can then have a more successful relationship. So how do we then like what's the antidote to these things? Right? Like what can a person like if they find themselves stonewalling, if they find themselves getting defensive or using contempt, like what can they do instead?
Right.
And like,
I was gonna say that the first thing is to kind of check inward, like what's coming up for you,
Mhm.
right? Like if someone's stonewalling, like what's happening? What makes it so hard to face the emotions and to face the feelings?
Yeah, exactly.
That's number one.
Like, it's like you said before, right? If one is outward and one is inward, like what prevents you from going inward?
Right.
Like, what are all those walls up, or like what happens if you have to face that? And then also, like, I think like a lot of it is need based, of like what's the need underneath, like
Right.
with criticism and with contempt, what is it that you're needing from them, and can you get those needs filled elsewhere, or can you get it from your spouse? If you can get it from your spouse, like
Right.
communicate it respectfully and nicely. If not, you might need to go elsewhere.
And I think that sometimes whenever we talk about these, like, those 4 things, like, it's like, oh no, I do this. What does this mean? And it's awareness,
Yeah.
right? It's awareness of like, notice what comes up for you and see how can you practically now communicate your needs, or make sure you're getting your needs met, or just make sure to do what needs to be done in a healthier way. Someone can be critical and not know that that is something that really leads to dysfunction.
Right. Exactly. Or they might not know where to start, right? They might feel like they're in that gridlock and saying, like, where do we even start? Like, to work on this marriage, maybe one of the things to start is to turn the criticism into helpful feedback, right? Give feedback rather than attacking them. Or in terms of contempt, like, notice when you're rolling your eyes, or instead, like, write down what you're feeling, or get in touch with what you're feeling about them, and work around all this.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great.
Thank you.